The golden chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor, as waiters in crisp white uniforms weaved through crowds of New York's richest people. It was one of those November evenings when the city sparkled like diamonds, and nowhere sparkled brighter than the penthouse of Dmitry Volkov, the Russian-American billionaire who'd made his fortune in artificial intelligence. Dmitry stood at the center of his own universe, a glass of whiskey worth more than most people's monthly salary in his hand. At 58, he had the kind of presence that made rooms go quiet when he entered. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his custom suit cost more than a car, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. He enjoyed these charity galas not because he cared about charity, but because they reminded everyone exactly how much money he had to throw around. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice cutting through the jazz music and conversation. The room of about 200 guests turned toward him, their jewelry catching the light like tiny stars. "I want to show you something special tonight." Two security guards appeared carrying a glass case between them. Inside, resting on purple velvet, was a violin that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The wood was the color of honey mixed with sunset, and even from across the room, you could see it was something extraordinary. "This," Dmitry announced, his chest puffing out with pride, "is the 1745 Guarneri del Gesù, one of only 135 ever made. This particular one was owned by Niccolò Paganini himself, the devil's violinist. I bought it last month at auction for $20 million. Gasps rippled through the crowd. $20 million for a piece of wooden strings. People pulled out their phones, snapping pictures to post on social media. "Look where I am," their posts would say. "Look at what I'm seeing." Dmitry carefully lifted the violin from its case, holding it like a holy relic. "They say Paganini sold his soul to the devil to play the way he did. His Caprice number 24 is considered impossible for normal humans to play perfectly. Even today's best violinists struggle with it." He paused, enjoying the attention, the way everyone hung on his words. The whiskey had made him bold, and the admiration had made him cruel in that special way only the very rich can be cruel. Carelessly, without even realizing it. "You know what?" He laughed, and it wasn't a kind sound. "I'll make you all a deal. Anyone here who can play Paganini's Caprice number 24 on this violin, perfectly, without a single mistake, I'll write them a check for $100 million right now." The room exploded in laughter. It was absurd, of course. First, who at a charity gala would even know how to hold a violin properly? Second, that piece was legendary for its difficulty. It required years of training, incredible skill, and fingers that could move faster than seemed humanly possible. Even professional violinists who'd studied their whole lives often failed at it. "Come on," Dmitry goaded, waving the violin in the air. "Any takers? You, Senator Morrison? I heard you played guitar in college." More laughter. "What about you, Jennifer? Didn't you take piano lessons?" A few brave souls, emboldened by champagne and the impossibility of the challenge, actually tried. A hedge fund manager picked up the violin and managed to make sounds that resembled a cat in distress. A famous actress posed with it for photos but admitted she had no idea which way to hold the bow. Each attempt was met with more laughter, more champagne, more jokes. Dmitry was in his element. This was what he loved most, reminding everyone that he could casually offer $100 million for something he knew no one could do. It was like a king throwing gold coins into the mud just to watch peasants scramble. "The offer stands all night," he declared, setting the violin on a special stand near the grand piano. $100 million. All you have to do is play one little song. As the party continued, people would walk by the violin, some touching it gently, most just taking selfies with it in the background. They talked about what they'd do with $100 million, buy islands, start companies, change the world. But it was all fantasy, like discussing what you'd do if you could fly. The violin sat there, beautiful and silent, a $20 million decoration at a party where people spent more on champagne than most families made in a year. The bow rested beside it, waiting for hands that knew its secret language. In the kitchen, behind the swinging doors that separated the servers from the served, Rosa Vasquez leaned against the steel counter, her face pale and clammy. She'd been Dmitry's housekeeper for 15 years, had cleaned up after more parties than she could count. But tonight her body was failing her. The fever had started that morning, and now her legs felt like water. "Mom, you need to go home," whispered a young woman in the same black server's uniform. This was Elena, Rosa's daughter. 19 years old with her mother's dark eyes, but something else too. A quiet confidence that seemed out of place in a servant's uniform. I can't leave. Mia, Mr. Volkov expects. Mr. Volkov won't even notice. There are 50 servers here tonight. Go home. I'll cover for you. Rosa wanted to protest, but another wave of dizziness hit her. She'd never missed a day of work, had cleaned through pneumonia once, but tonight she could barely stand. With reluctance that only a mother's pride could produce, she finally agreed. Elena helped her mother out the service entrance and into a taxi, pressing the last $20 from her pocket into Rosa's hand for the fare. Then she returned to the party, picking up a tray of champagne glasses, and entered the main room. She'd been in this penthouse many times as a child, when school was out, and Rosa had no one to watch her. She knew every corner, every hiding spot, had spent hours reading in the library while her mother cleaned, but she'd never seen it like this, full of people who wore her entire college tuition as a necklace. As she moved through the crowd, invisible in the way only service workers can be, she heard the laughter, the mockery, saw the violin sitting there like bait in a trap that would never spring. Her fingers, hidden at her sides, began to move in tiny, practiced patterns, muscle memory of something no one in this room could imagine. She paused near the violin, close enough to see the grain of the wood, the mother-of-pearl inlay on the bow. Her heart beat a rhythm she knew by heart, the opening measures of Caprice number 24. But she kept walking, kept serving, kept being invisible. After all, she was just the maid's daughter. Nobody here even knew her name. The party swirled on, oblivious to the girl who moved among them carrying more than champagne on her tray. She carried a secret that would soon shatter the careful walls between their world and hers, between those who owned $20 million violins and those who cleaned them. The night was still young, the champagne still flowing, and the violin still waiting. The impossible challenge hung in the air like a joke everyone was in on, except for one person who knew, who had always known, that impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been done yet. Elena moved through the crowd like a ghost, balancing her silver tray while the rich guests grabbed champagne glasses without even looking at her face. She'd learned this skill from her mother, how to be present but invisible, how to serve without being seen. It was an art form, really, the way service workers could exist in a room full of people who acted like they weren't there. The uniform felt strange on her skin. It belonged to her mother, taken from the closet that morning when Rosa first started feeling sick. Elena had promised she'd just come for a few hours, just until her mother felt better. But now, seeing her mother's condition, she knew she'd be here all night. Every time she passed the violin, her heart did something funny in her chest. It was like running into an old friend in an unexpected place. The Guarnerie del Gesù. She'd read about this exact violin in a library book 3 years ago. She knew its history, knew every scratch and mark that made it unique. But more than that, she knew the piece everyone was laughing about. Caprice number 24 wasn't just difficult, it was a monster that ate musicians for breakfast. Another glass, someone said, grabbing champagne from her tray without looking up. She recognized him from the business magazines her mother sometimes brought home, a hotel owner worth billions. His watch alone could pay for her brother's medical treatments for 5 years. Elena nodded silently and moved on. This was the deal. You didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then you kept it short. But inside her mind, a different world existed. Inside her mind, her fingers were moving through complicated patterns, dancing across invisible strings. The secret she carried felt heavier than the tray. 3 months ago, she'd received the letter that changed everything. A full scholarship to Juilliard, the best music school in the country. She'd auditioned in secret, using the school music room after hours, practicing on a borrowed violin because her own had been sold years ago. The acceptance letter was hidden in her drawer at home, still unopened in front of her mother. How could she tell Rosa that she'd been secretly playing all these years? How could she explain the hours of practice, the competitions entered under fake names, the videos posted online from accounts that couldn't be traced back to her? The truth was complicated, wrapped up in guilt and love and fear. 5 years ago, when her brother Carlos got sick, Elena had watched her mother sell everything valuable they owned. The last thing to go was Elena's violin, a beautiful student instrument that her mother had saved for 3 years to buy. Rosa had cried that night, thinking Elena was asleep. That was the night Elena promised herself 2 things. She would never stop playing, and she would never let her mother know that she'd continued, so she found other ways. The music teacher at school, Mr. Rodriguez, let her use the practice rooms. She played in subway stations with her face covered, earning money that she secretly slipped into her mother's purse. She entered competitions in different boroughs where no one would recognize her. She became two people, the dutiful daughter who'd given up music and the ghost violinist who played in shadows. "Excuse me, miss?" Elena snapped back to reality. An elderly woman in diamonds was looking at her with kind eyes, a rarity at these events. "Could you point me toward the powder room?" "Down the hall, second door on the right, ma'am." "Thank you, dear. You have beautiful hands, by the way. Are you a musician?" Elena's breath caught. "No, ma'am. Just a server." The woman studied her for a moment, then smiled knowingly. "My mistake." As the woman walked away, Elena's hands trembled slightly. She forced herself to keep moving, to keep serving, to keep being invisible. But the violin called to her. Every time she passed it, the pull grew stronger. She thought about Carlos, 13 years old and needing another surgery next month. The insurance would cover some of it, but not all. Never all. She thought about the eviction notice they'd received last week. 3 months behind on rent because Rosa's hours had been cut. She thought about her mother's hands, swollen from years of harsh cleaning chemicals, and how she never complained, never stopped working, never stopped believing that somehow things would get better. The crowd was getting drunker now, louder. The attempts at the violin had stopped, and it had become just another prop in their game of showing off wealth. Dmitry Volkov was holding court near the windows, telling a story about buying a yacht from a Saudi prince. His laugh boomed across the room, self-satisfied and sharp. "The funny thing is," he was saying, "I don't even like sailing. I just wanted to own something that he wanted." The group around him laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Elena watched from across the room, saw the way he gestured with his hands, the casual cruelty in his smile. This was a man who'd never wondered where his next meal would come from, never watched his mother count coins to buy milk, never felt the weight of talent trapped inside with no way to let it out. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her mother. "Everything okay, mija? Don't work too hard." Even sick, even exhausted, Rosa was worried about her. Elena typed back quickly, "Everything's fine, rest." As she put her phone away, she overheard two women talking near the dessert table. "Did you see that video that went viral last month? The street violinist? The one in the subway? Playing in that hurricane? That's the one. They never showed her face, but God, could she play. Someone said she might be at Juilliard." Elena's heart pounded. That had been her, playing in the subway station during the storm when she thought no one would be around. Someone had filmed it, and it had gotten 3 million views before she'd managed to convince the person to take it down. But the internet never forgets. She retreated to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. Other servers bustled around her, preparing the next course. No one paid her any attention. She was just Rosa's daughter, filling in for the night. But inside, the music was building. Every note of Caprice number 24 was alive in her mind. She'd learned it in secret, spending 6 months on just the first page. It was a piece that required everything. Perfect intonation, impossible finger stretches, bow techniques that most violinists never mastered. But she'd conquered it the way she'd conquered everything else in her life. Moment by moment, note by note. In borrowed practice rooms and empty subway stations, the supervisor called for more champagne to be brought out. Elena picked up a fresh tray and headed back to the party. The violin was still there, waiting. The offer was still standing. $100 million for the impossible. As she served the champagne, she caught her reflection in a mirror. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to be. Invisible, forgettable, just another server in a black uniform. But underneath, her fingers were moving, playing silent symphonies that only she could hear. The party would go on for hours more. Dmitry would keep laughing, keep showing off his treasure. The guests would keep drinking, keep pretending that the distance between them and the servants was natural, inevitable, unchangeable. But Elena knew something they didn't. She knew that sometimes the impossible was just waiting for the right moment to become possible. And that moment, she could feel it in her bones, was getting closer with every passing minute. The violin waited, patient as destiny. And somewhere in the city, in a small apartment in Queens, Rosa Vasquez tossed in her fever dreams, not knowing that her daughter was about to change both their lives forever. The stage was set. The players were in position. All that remained was for someone to be brave enough to step out of the shadows and into the light. The clock on the penthouse wall showed nearly 11 when everything changed. Elena had just finished serving what felt like her 100th tray of champagne when she heard Dimitri's voice boom across the room again. "Come on, people. The night is getting boring. Doesn't anyone want to become a 100-millionaire? The offer still stands." He was definitely drunk now, his face red from expensive whiskey, his tie loosened. What about the staff? Maybe one of these servants is secretly a concert violinist. The crowd laughed at this, the idea so ridiculous to them that it became the biggest joke of the night. Some of the guests started pointing at different servers, making mock suggestions. What about him? He looks musical. More laughter. Elena felt her stomach twist. She watched as Dimitri picked up the violin again, waving it around carelessly. Her heart jumped every time he nearly dropped it. That violin had survived nearly 300 years. It deserved better than becoming a drunk billionaire's prop. "You know what?" Dimitri slurred slightly. "Let's make this interesting. Any of you servants want to try? I'll even raise it to 150 million. How about that? More than any of you will see in 10 lifetimes. The other servers looked at the floor, some with embarrassment, others with anger they couldn't show. This was their life, being the butt of rich people's jokes, being reminded constantly of their place in the world. Elena saw Manuel, an older waiter who'd worked these events for 30 years, clench his jaw so hard she thought his teeth might crack. But then something happened inside Elena. It started as heat in her chest, spreading through her arms and into her fingers. She thought of her mother, sick in bed, worried about losing this job. She thought of Carlos doing his homework by candlelight last week because the electricity got cut off. She thought of every time she'd hidden her talent, every time she'd played in the shadows, every time she'd made herself smaller so others could feel bigger. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Carlos. "Mom's fever is worse. Should I call 911? The ambulance would cost $2,000 they didn't have. The hospital bills would bury them. Unless..." Elena set down her tray with a sound that seemed to echo through the room. Several guests turned to look at her, surprised that one of the invisible servants had made a noise. She started walking toward the violin and the crowd parted, more out of shock than respect. "Wait, wait, wait," Dimitri laughed, pointing at her. "Are you serious? You want to try?" Elena didn't answer. She couldn't trust her voice not to shake. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed on the violin. The room had gone quiet now, the kind of quiet that happens when something unexpected breaks the script everyone's been following. "This is Rosa's daughter," someone whispered. "The cleaning lady's kid." "This should be good," another voice said. "Bet she doesn't even know how to hold it." Dimitri was enjoying this immensely. Sure, let the maid's daughter have a go, why not? It'll be a story to tell at next week's party." He held out the violin toward her with an exaggerated bow. "Be careful with it, girl. It's worth more than your family will make in 1,000 years. Elena took the violin, and the moment her hands touched it, something shifted in the room. She held it with a reverence that made people unconsciously step back. This wasn't how someone held an object they didn't understand. This was how someone held something sacred. She examined it carefully, checking the strings, the bridge, the tension. Her movements were precise, professional. The movements of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The laughter in the room started to die down, replaced by confusion. "She's actually going to try," someone whispered. Elena picked up the bow, checking its weight, its balance. She tightened the horsehair with practiced turns of the screw. Then she brought the violin to her shoulder, and in that moment, her entire posture transformed. She wasn't a server anymore. She wasn't the maid's daughter. She was something else entirely. But before she could play a note, Dimitri laughed again. Hold on. You do know what piece we're talking about, right? Paganini's Caprice number 24? It's not Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Sweetheart. Elena finally looked at him, really looked at him. I know what it is. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the room. There was something in it that made Dimitri's smile falter for just a second. All right then, he said, recovering his smugness. But let's be clear about the rules. The entire piece, no mistakes. One wrong note and you're done. And everyone here is a witness. If you somehow pull this off, I'll write that check right here, right now. The crowd pressed closer, their phones coming out to record what they assumed would be a disaster. Elena saw the red recording lights, dozens of them, all waiting to capture her humiliation. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in that darkness she saw her mother's face, her brother's smile, the acceptance letter from Juilliard. When she opened her eyes, she was ready. The first note of Caprice number 24 isn't the hardest, but it sets the tone for everything that follows. It needs to be perfect, strong but not harsh, confident but not aggressive. Elena had practiced this one note 1,000 times in empty rooms, on borrowed violins in her mind while scrubbing dishes. She raised the bow, and the room held its breath. The note that came out was pure, clear, and absolutely perfect. It rang through the penthouse like a bell, silencing even the city noise from outside. The second note followed, then the third, and by the fourth measure, something extraordinary was happening. Elena's fingers began to move with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. The bow danced across the strings, producing sounds that shouldn't come from wood and horsehair. The opening theme of Caprice 24 filled the room, playful, challenging, defiant. The phones that had been raised to record a disaster stayed up, but now for a different reason. The people behind them stood frozen, watching something they'd never expected to see. Some of the guests who knew classical music, and there were a few, gasped audibly as Elena navigated the first variation, a passage that required the violinist to play a melody and its accompaniment simultaneously. But Elena wasn't just playing the notes. She was telling a story. Every phrase was a sentence, every variation a chapter. Her eyes were closed now, and her body moved with the music, swaying slightly, her face showing the concentration of someone walking a tightrope over an abyss. The room had become a concert hall. The servers stopped serving. The bartenders stopped pouring drinks. Even the kitchen staff had crept out to see what was happening. 200 people stood in absolute silence, watching a girl in a server's uniform do something that most professional violinists couldn't do. Dimitri's face had gone pale. He stood near the piano, his whiskey glass forgotten in his hand, watching his joke turn into something else entirely. His mouth was slightly open and his eyes darted between Elena and the crowd, as if looking for someone to tell him this wasn't real. But it was real. Every note was real. The girl he'd walked past 100 times, whose mother had cleaned his toilets for 15 years, was playing his $20 million violin like it was an extension of her own body. She wasn't just meeting the challenge, she was destroying it, rebuilding it, making it her own. The third variation came, the one with the flying spiccato, where the bow had to bounce off the strings in controlled chaos. Elena's bow became a hummingbird's wing, moving so fast it was almost invisible. The notes cascaded through the room like water over rocks, each one distinct and perfect. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Oh my God." Someone else said, "This is impossible." But mostly, there was just silence and the sound of Paganini's devil music being played by an angel in a servant's uniform. Elena didn't hear any of it. She was somewhere else now. In that place musicians go when the music takes over, when their bodies become instruments for something bigger than themselves. She was 5 years old, holding her first violin. She was 14, playing in a subway station for dollar bills. She was 19, standing in a billionaire's penthouse, proving that talent doesn't care about bank accounts or social status. The music built toward its climax, and everyone in the room leaned forward as if pulled by invisible strings. Elena's fingers were flying now, reaching intervals that seemed physically impossible, producing harmonics that rang like crystal bells. The final variation was coming, the one that had defeated so many great violinists, the one that Paganini himself said was a deal with the devil. But Elena wasn't thinking about the devil. She was thinking about her mother, her brother, and the truth that had been hiding inside her for so long finally set free. The fourth variation erupted from the violin like controlled lightning. Elena's left hand moved up and down the fingerboard in patterns that defied logic, her fingers finding notes in positions that most violinists spent years trying to reach. The bow in her right hand had become something alive, creating rhythms within rhythms, melodies wrapped inside harmonies. A woman in the front row grabbed her husband's arm so tightly he winced. She was a patron of the Metropolitan Opera, had season tickets to the Philharmonic, and she knew what she was witnessing. This wasn't just good, this was historic. The music filled every corner of the penthouse, bouncing off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. But it also seemed to fill something else, the empty spaces between people, the gaps that money had created. For these few minutes, the room wasn't divided between servers and served, between those who owned and those who cleaned. There was just the music and the girl creating it. Elena's face showed the strain now. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her breathing came in careful rhythm with the phrases. The fifth variation required her to play double stops, 2 notes at once, while maintaining a melody line that jumped across all 4 strings. Her fingers stretched into positions that looked painful, but the sound that came out was pure beauty. In the back of the room, Manuel, the elderly waiter, was crying. He didn't even try to hide it. He'd worked these events for 3 decades, had been invisible for so long he'd almost believed it himself. But watching Elena, he remembered that invisible didn't mean worthless. It just meant overlooked. The kitchen staff pressed against the doorway, their faces showing a mixture of pride and amazement. They all knew Rosa, knew how hard she worked, how she never complained even when rich guests treated her like furniture. Now her daughter was making those same people question everything they thought they knew about the world. Dmitri hadn't moved since the second variation. The whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly, creating tiny ripples in the amber liquid. His mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. This girl. He tried to remember if he'd ever even looked at her directly. Rosa had mentioned a daughter, hadn't she? Something about school, about being smart. But he'd never listened, never cared. The help's personal lives were just background noise to him. Now that background noise was playing. Paganini on his $20 million violin, better than anyone he'd ever heard. The sixth variation came like a storm. It required techniques that had names most people couldn't pronounce. Ricochet, left-hand pizzicato, artificial harmonics. Elena's hands became a blur of precise movement. The violin sang, cried, laughed, and screamed all at once. It was telling the story of every late night she'd practiced in secret. Every competition she'd entered under false names. Every dollar she'd earned playing in subway stations and secretly slipped into her mother's purse. A man near the window was frantically texting someone. He was a talent scout for Deutsche Grammophon, one of the world's most prestigious classical music labels, and he was trying to explain to his boss why they needed to get on a plane to New York immediately. His texts were almost incoherent. You won't believe. Playing Paganini 24. She's a server. This is insane. Get here now. The seventh variation was where most violinists fell apart. It required the player to maintain a melodic line while playing rapid arpeggios that spanned the entire range of the instrument. Elena had practiced this section in bathroom stalls, miming the fingering silently while her mother cleaned offices at night. She'd mastered it on a violin made of cardboard and rubber bands when she couldn't access a real instrument, now on one of the finest violins ever made. It sang like it had been waiting 300 years for her to play it. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Who is she?" The question rippled through the room. People were searching on their phones, trying to find any information about Rosa's daughter. Then someone found it, a YouTube video from 3 years ago filmed in grainy quality in a subway station. The face was partially hidden, but the playing was unmistakable. The video had been titled "Unknown Angel Plays for Surgery Money" before it was taken down. "It's her," the person whispered. "She's the subway virtuoso. She's been hiding this whole time." The eighth variation came like a declaration of war against every limitation life had placed on Elena. It was all artificial harmonics, those ethereal notes that sounded like they came from another world. Each one required perfect finger placement and bow pressure. Get it wrong by a millimeter and it would screech. Elena hit every single one, creating a cascade of heavenly sounds that made several people gasp. She was telling them all something with this music, something that couldn't be said in words. She was telling them about talent that blooms in darkness, about beauty that grows in concrete, about the lie that some people are born to serve while others are born to be served. Every note was a revolution, every phrase a protest, every variation a victory. The man who owned the largest hotel chain in America slowly sat down, his legs unable to hold him. He was remembering his own grandmother, who'd cleaned houses her whole life, who'd died without anyone knowing she could paint portraits that belonged in museums. How much genius had the world lost to circumstance? How much beauty had been mopped away with dirty water? Elena entered the ninth variation, her body now fully given over to the music. This was the section that required the widest finger stretches, positions that some violinists physically couldn't achieve. But Elena had been stretching her fingers since she was 5, first on her little student violin, then on imaginary fingerboards when the real violin was sold. Her hands had been shaped by necessity into instruments of impossible reach. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were witnessing. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Others stood with their mouths open, their champagne glasses forgotten. The phones kept recording, broadcasting this moment to the world. Within minutes, clips would be viral. Within hours, the whole world would know about the maid's daughter who destroyed a billionaire's joke. But Elena knew none of this. She was approaching the final variations, the ones that Paganini himself had reportedly played only when he wanted to prove that the devil was real, and lived in his violin. Her uniform was soaked with sweat now. Her hair had come loose from its neat bun, and her face showed the exhaustion of running a marathon at sprint speed. The 10th variation exploded into the room with violence and beauty combined. It was all about speed, pure, ridiculous, impossible speed. Elena's fingers moved so fast they seemed to multiply as if she had grown extra hands. The bow became invisible, just a blur creating a waterfall of notes that crashed over everyone in the room. Dimitri's legs finally gave out. He sat heavily in a chair, his face white as paper. The joke was over. It had been over from the first note. But now he understood the magnitude of what he'd done. He'd offered $100 million thinking it was safe, thinking it was impossible. He'd never considered that impossible was just a word people used when they couldn't imagine someone wanting something badly enough. The 11th variation came like a whisper after a scream. It was delicate, requiring the lightest touch, the most subtle control. Elena's bow floated over the strings like a butterfly, producing notes so quiet that everyone held their breath to hear them. This was the part where she usually thought of her mother, of watching those swollen hands carefully cleaning precious things that belonged to other people. Now she was holding something precious, but she wasn't cleaning it. She was making it sing. The room had become a cathedral. The music was a prayer, a confession, a demand for justice all at once. Elena was no longer just playing Paganini's Caprice No. 24. She was rewriting the story of every invisible person who'd ever served champagne to people who didn't see them, who'd cleaned up messes they didn't make, who'd hidden their light because the world told them they didn't deserve to shine. The final variation was approaching, and everyone could feel it. The air in the room had become electric, charged with the possibility that they were about to witness something that would change everything. The securities, the lawyers, Dimitri himself, they all knew that in less than a minute the world was going to shift on its axis. Elena knew it too. As she prepared for the final assault on impossible, she opened her eyes for just a moment. She saw the faces watching her, shocked, amazed, transformed. She saw Dimitri collapsed in his chair, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. She saw the other servers standing proud for the first time all night. And in her mind she saw her mother, her brother, and the letter from Juilliard. She saw a future that had seemed impossible just an hour ago. The bow touched the strings for the final variation and Elena smiled. The impossible was about to become inevitable. The final variation began like thunder after lightning. Elena's entire body became part of the performance. Her shoulders rolled with the phrases, her head tilted back during the ascending runs, and her feet, still in the practical black shoes her mother had bought her for serving, seemed to dance in place. This was the moment Paganini had written to separate the masters from everyone else. It combined everything, the speed, the stretches, the double stops, the harmonics, into one impossible finale. Most violinists who attempted it looked like they were fighting the instrument. Elena looked like she was dancing with an old friend. In the crowd, phones were buzzing with incoming messages. The videos uploaded just minutes ago were already spreading across social media like wildfire. "You have to see this," the messages said. "A maid's daughter is playing Paganini at a billionaire's party. This is unreal." A woman in a designer dress was speaking urgently into her phone. She was the director of Lincoln Center, and she was canceling tomorrow's board meeting. "I don't care what the agenda was," she hissed. "We need to find this girl tonight." But the most interesting reactions were from the people who really understood what they were witnessing. An elderly man near the back, a retired violinist from the New York Philharmonic, had his hands pressed against his chest. He'd tried to play this piece for 40 years. He'd never made it past the 8th variation without a mistake. Now he was watching a 19-year-old in a server's uniform play it like she was born to it. The music building toward its climax was doing something to the room. The divide between the servers and the served was crumbling with every note. A billionaire's wife found herself standing next to a busboy, both of them crying. A senator was gripping the hand of a kitchen worker, and neither of them seemed to notice or care. Elena hit a passage that required her to play 64 notes in the span of 4 seconds. Her fingers moved so fast that they seemed to bend the laws of physics. The sound that came out was like machine gun fire, but musical. Each note crystal clear despite the impossible speed. Several professional musicians in the crowd later swore that what they saw that night wasn't physically possible, yet they'd watched it happen. "She's not real," someone whispered. "She can't be real, but she was real." She was Rosa's daughter, who'd gotten up at 5 in the morning to practice in the school music room before anyone arrived. She was the girl who'd learned music theory from library books because she couldn't afford lessons. She was the one who'd spent her childhood in this very penthouse, invisible in the corner while her mother cleaned, studying the paintings on the walls and dreaming of a different life. The final 30 seconds of the piece were approaching the part where Paganini had supposedly laughed and said that only the devil could play it perfectly. It required the violinist to maintain 3 separate melody lines simultaneously, while executing technical passages that most people couldn't play slowly, much less at tempo. Elena's face was a mask of concentration now. Sweat ran down her neck, staining the collar of her mother's uniform. Her left hand was cramping from the stretches and her right arm burned from the bow work. But she didn't slow down. If anything, she pushed harder. She thought of her mother's face that morning, pale with fever but still worried about missing work. She thought of Carlos doing his homework by candlelight, never complaining, always smiling. She thought of every night she'd fallen asleep to the sound of her mother crying quietly in the next room, trying to figure out how to make $20 stretch to cover a week of groceries. The anger fueled her. The love fueled her. The years of hiding fueled her. Every emotion she'd ever suppressed while serving champagne to people who looked through her like she was made of glass. It all poured into the music. 10 seconds left. The violin was screaming now, crying, singing, and laughing all at once. The Guarneri del Gesù, which had been played by the greatest violinists in history, seemed to recognize that it was in the hands of someone special. The 300-year-old wood resonated with a richness that made several people step back, as if the sound was too beautiful to stand close to. 5 seconds. Elena's eyes were closed tight, her entire being focused on these last few notes. They had to be perfect, not just for the money, not just for the challenge, but for every person who'd ever been told they couldn't, they shouldn't, they weren't good enough. 3 seconds. The bow was moving so fast it was creating its own breeze. The strings were in danger of snapping from the pressure. The violin was pushed to its absolute limit, producing sounds at the very edge of what the instrument could do. 2 seconds. A final run up the fingerboard, a cascade of notes that sounded like stars falling from the sky. 1 second. The last note, a high E, played as a harmonic, pure and perfect and impossible. Silence. Elena held the bow in the air for a moment, frozen in the final position. The note continued to ring in the air, bouncing off the windows, the walls, the chandelier. It seemed to go on forever, that one perfect note, holding everyone in its spell. Then she lowered the violin, and the spell broke. The room exploded. It wasn't applause, it was something more primal, more necessary. It was the sound of 200 people discovering that everything they thought they knew about the world was wrong. People were screaming, crying, hugging strangers. The senators and CEOs and hedge fund managers were on their feet, applauding until their hands hurt. Manuel, the elderly waiter, was on his knees, openly sobbing. The kitchen staff poured out of the doorway, cheering and crying. Someone shouted, "Brava, brava," in a voice torn with emotion. But the loudest silence came from Dmitry Volkov. He sat in his chair like a statue, his face completely white, his eyes fixed on Elena. The whiskey glass had fallen from his hand at some point, creating a puddle of amber liquid at his feet. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. Elena stood in the center of the chaos, still holding the violin. She was shaking, her whole body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. Her uniform was soaked with sweat. Her hair had completely come undone and her face was flushed with effort. But her eyes were clear and focused, and they were looking directly at Dmitry. The crowd gradually quieted, realizing that the moment of truth had arrived. The bet, the $100 million, the impossible challenge that had just been destroyed. A man in an expensive suit, clearly a lawyer, leaned down to whisper urgently in Dimitri's ear. But Dimitri didn't seem to hear him. He was still staring at Elena, his face cycling through emotions like a broken slot machine. Shock, disbelief, anger, fear, and something else. Something that might have been shame. That was, someone in the crowd said, then stopped, unable to find words big enough. I've been playing violin for 30 years, another voice said, and I could never. The talent scout from Deutsche Grammophon was practically screaming into his phone now. I don't care if it's midnight. Wake everyone up. We need contracts drawn up now. Someone else is going to sign her if we don't move fast. But Elena wasn't listening to any of them. She was remembering something her mother had told her when she was little, when she'd asked why they had to be so quiet when they cleaned the big houses. We're not invisible because we're not important, Mija, Rosa had said. We're invisible because sometimes it's safer that way. But someday you'll be so bright that no one will be able to look away. That day had come. The room was completely silent now, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. The servers, the guests, even the security guards, they all stood frozen, watching the girl in the server's uniform hold the $20 million violin like she was born to hold it. Elena finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. Mr. Volkov, she said, using the same tone her mother always used, respectful but not submissive. I believe you owe me some money. The words hung in the air like the last note of the caprice. Someone in the crowd actually laughed, a nervous, disbelieving sound. The lawyers were whispering frantically now, but everyone could see the truth on their faces. There were 200 witnesses. Some of the most powerful people in New York had seen the bet, heard the terms, watched it happen. Dimitri slowly stood up. His legs were unsteady, and he had to grip the chair for support. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse like he'd been screaming, though he'd been silent the whole time. Who are you? He asked. Elena lifted her chin slightly. I'm the maid's daughter, she said. The one you never saw. The one who's been invisible in your house for years. The one whose mother you've walked past 1,000 times without ever learning her last name. She paused, then added, and I'm the girl who just played Paganini's Caprice No. 24 perfectly on your violin, in front of 200 witnesses, who are all recording. The phones were indeed still recording. By now the video had been shared thousands of times. Maid's daughter was already trending. News outlets were picking up the story. The world was watching. Dimitri looked around the room, perhaps hoping to find an ally, an escape route, a way to make this not be happening. But all he saw were faces looking back at him, waiting to see if he was the kind of man who honored his word or the kind who didn't. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of everything that was about to change. Dimitri stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. His face went through so many changes, red to white to gray and back again. His hands opened and closed at his sides like he was trying to grab onto something solid in a world that had suddenly turned liquid. The lawyer beside him kept whispering urgently, pulling out his phone, showing him something on the screen. Probably the videos that were already going viral, the ones that showed Dimitri making the bet clearly, loudly, in front of everyone. There was no denying it, no taking it back, no clever legal trick that could make this go away. Mr. Volkov, Elena said again, her voice steady, despite the violin trembling slightly in her hands. My mother is sick. My brother needs surgery. We're 3 months behind on rent, so I'm asking you, will you honor your word? That's when something unexpected happened. A voice from the crowd spoke up, a woman in a silver dress who Elena recognized as the wife of a Supreme Court justice. We all heard the bet, Dimitri, she said clearly. We all witnessed it. Then another voice, a man who owned half the commercial real estate in Manhattan. The girl played perfectly. We saw it. One by one, voices from the crowd began to speak up. Not mockingly, not jokingly, but seriously. These were people who lived by contracts and deals, who understood that a person's word, especially when given publicly, was everything. If Dimitri backed out now, who would ever trust him again? But more than that, something had shifted in the room. The music had done something to them. For 10 minutes, they'd watched someone they'd considered beneath notice prove that talent, real talent, didn't care about bank accounts or bloodlines. They'd been moved, genuinely moved by art in a way that their expensive season tickets to the opera rarely managed. Dimitri's phone started ringing. He looked at it, his publicist. Then it rang again, his business manager. Then again, a number he didn't recognize. The world was calling, wanting to know what the billionaire who'd bet $100 million was going to do. He looked at Elena again. Really looked at her this time. Not at the uniform, not at the servant, but at the person. She was young, maybe the same age as his own daughter who was currently at Yale studying art history on his dime. But this girl's eyes held something his daughter's didn't. The hardness that comes from real struggle. The strength that grows from carrying weight that should break you. Your mother, he said slowly, his voice cracking. Rosa? She's worked for me for 15 years? Yes, Elena replied. Every Tuesday and Thursday she cleans your offices. Every other Saturday she does this penthouse. She takes 3 buses to get here because she can't afford the subway fare for the direct route. Dimitri flinched at each detail, as if being hit by small stones. How had he never known this? How had he never asked? And you learned violin at public school until the funding was cut. Then from library books and YouTube videos. I practiced on a cardboard violin for 2 years after Mom had to sell my real one to pay for Carlos's medication. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A cardboard violin? She'd learned Paganini on cardboard and determination. The elderly man who'd been crying earlier, the retired Philharmonic violinist, stepped forward. Young lady, he said, his voice shaking with emotion, I need you to know something. I've heard Heifetz play. I've heard Perlman. I've heard all the greats. What you just did, it wasn't just technically perfect. It was transcendent. The talent scout from Deutsche Grammophon couldn't contain himself anymore. He pushed through the crowd. Miss, I'm with Deutsche Grammophon. Whatever happens here tonight, I want you to know. We're prepared to offer you a recording contract immediately. Tonight, name your terms. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once. The director of Lincoln Center was pushing forward. The chairman of the Juilliard board, who'd been at the party by coincidence, was trying to get Elena's attention. Business cards were being thrust at her from all directions, but Elena kept her eyes on Dimitri. This wasn't about recording contracts or job offers. This was about justice. This was about her mother never having to clean another toilet while sick with fever. This was about Carlos getting his surgery. This was about every night she'd played violin in the subway while hiding her face, ashamed not of her music but of her need. Dimitri pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He opened his banking app, the one that managed his personal accounts. The room watched in silence as he began typing. The only sound was his fingers on the screen and Elena's still heavy breathing from the performance. What's your full name? He asked quietly. Elena Maria Vasquez. He typed more. The lawyer tried to stop him, grabbing his arm, but Dimitri shook him off with sudden violence. Don't, he said sharply. Just don't. He continued typing, then turned the phone toward Elena. I need your account information. For the transfer. Elena's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the violin. She gave him the information for the only bank account her family had, the one that currently held $43.16. Dimitri initiated the transfer. $100 million. The phone asked for confirmation 3 times as if it couldn't believe what was happening. He confirmed each time. It'll process by Monday, he said, his voice hollow. The bank will call you. They'll help you set up proper accounts, financial advisors, whatever you need. The room erupted again, but Elena wasn't done. She carefully, reverently held out the Guarneri del Gesù toward Dimitri. Your violin, she said. He stared at it like it was a foreign object. I bought it as an investment, as a trophy, something to show off. He looked at Elena's hands, still holding it out to him. It's never sounded like that before. Not when the dealers played it for me. Not when the concert violinist I hired to demonstrate it played. It was waiting for you, wasn't it? Elena didn't answer, just continued holding out the violin. Dimitri shook his head slowly. Keep it, the room gasped collectively. $20 million worth of violin on top of the $100 million. I can't, Elena said immediately. That wasn't the bet. It's not about the bet, Dimitri said, and for the first time all night his voice sounded genuinely human. Call it 15 years of back pay for your mother, for all the times I walked past her like she was furniture, for never learning her name, for... He stopped, unable to continue. The crowd was silent now, watching something they'd never expected to see. Dmitry Volkov having what might have been his first genuine emotion in decades. But then another unexpected voice spoke up. It was Rosa. She stood in the doorway supported by two kitchen workers. Someone had called her, told her she needed to come immediately. She was still in her nightgown with a coat thrown over it. Her face flushed with fever, but her eyes were fierce as she looked at her daughter. Elena Maria Vasquez, she said in Spanish, then switched to English for the room. What have you done? Elena ran to her mother, still clutching the violin, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. Mama, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I hid it from you. I never stopped playing. I couldn't stop. Music it's who I am. Rosa pulled her daughter close, her own tears falling. I know, mija. I've always known. I heard you in the subway. I saw the videos. I found the Juilliard letter. She pulled back to look at Elena's face. I was just waiting for you to trust me enough to tell me. The room was crying now. Billionaires and servers alike, all watching a mother and daughter hold each other in the middle of a penthouse that had just become the site of a miracle. Mrs. Vasquez, Dmitry said, approaching slowly. I owe you an apology. More than an apology. I owe you. You owe me nothing, Rosa said, straightening despite her illness, finding that dignity that no amount of poverty could take away. You paid my daughter what you promised. That's enough. It's not, Dmitry said quietly. It's not nearly enough, but it's a start. The party was obviously over, but no one wanted to leave. They stood around in clusters discussing what they'd witnessed, trying to process it. The servers had stopped serving entirely, standing with the guests as equals for the first time all night. The talent scout was still trying to get Elena's attention. The Lincoln Center director was on the phone with the board. The Juilliard chairman was promising Elena anything she wanted. Any teacher, any program, any opportunity. But Elena just stood with her mother, holding the violin that was now hers, trying to understand that her life had just changed completely. No more hiding. No more pretending to be less than she was. No more invisible. The videos were already everywhere. Maid's daughter had become the Paganini miracle. News vans were pulling up outside the building. The world wanted to know about the girl who'd done the impossible, but in that moment Elena didn't care about any of it. She cared that her mother was here, that Rosa was proud of her, that Carlos would get his surgery, that they would never have to choose between rent and food again. She looked at Dmitry one more time. He looked older, smaller somehow, as if the night had deflated him. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Maybe being deflated was the first step to being rebuilt as something better. Thank you, she said simply, for keeping your word. He nodded, unable to speak. The crowd was beginning to disperse, but slowly, reluctantly, as if leaving would mean admitting this had all been real. Tomorrow, Elena would wake up a millionaire. Tomorrow. The next morning, Elena woke up in her small bedroom thinking it had all been a dream. The water stain on the ceiling was still there. The sound of sirens from the street below still filtered through the thin windows. Everything looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. Then her phone started ringing. And ringing. And ringing. She picked it up to find 847 missed calls, thousands of text messages, and her email inbox so full it had stopped accepting new messages. The first voicemail was from Bank of America, confirming that a transfer of $100 million was being processed into her account. She had to play it 3 times before the words made sense. Rosa knocked on the door, entering with a cup of tea. She looked better than she had last night, though still weak. The news trucks are outside, she said calmly, as if this was a normal thing to say. There are at least 50 of them. Elena went to the window and peeked through the blinds. Their street, usually empty except for the occasional police car, was packed with news vans, reporters, cameras. Their neighbors were standing on stoops pointing at their building, taking pictures. What do I do, Mama? Elena asked, suddenly feeling very young. Rosa sat on the bed beside her daughter. First, you call Carlos's doctor. You schedule that surgery. Then we call a lawyer. A good one, not like that man who helped with Papa's will. Then, she paused, smiling slightly. Then you decide who you want to be. By noon, their tiny apartment had become command central. The Juilliard chairman had personally come to their door, climbing 5 flights of stairs in his expensive suit, offering Elena not just admission, but a full professorship eventually, if she wanted it. The Deutsche Grammophon executives had set up a makeshift office in their living room, presenting recording contracts. 3 of the world's best violinists had called, offering to mentor her. But the most unexpected visitor was Dmitri Volkov himself. He stood in their doorway at 2 p.m., looking nothing like the arrogant billionaire from the night before. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a sweater, and his face showed exhaustion. Behind him stood 2 men carrying something large and flat. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, addressing Rosa. "But I have something else." Rosa, ever gracious even to the man who'd ignored her for 15 years, invited him in. He looked around the apartment, at the water stains, the patched furniture, the pictures of Elena and Carlos on the walls, and his face showed something that might have been physical pain. "This is how you've been living," he said quietly, "while cleaning my 7 homes." "It's honest living," Rosa replied with dignity. Dmitri nodded, then gestured to the men. They unveiled what they'd brought, a painted portrait. It was Elena from last night, caught in the middle of playing, her face transformed by the music. But it wasn't new. The painting style was classical, the canvas aged. "This was painted in 1823, Dmitri explained. "It's called The Unknown Violinist. I bought it 10 years ago because the experts said it might be valuable. But look at the face." Everyone leaned in and Elena gasped. The face in the 200-year-old painting looked exactly like her. Not similar, identical. The same eyes, the same chin, the same way of holding the violin. "The violinist in the painting was never identified," Dmitri continued. "She was said to be a servant in Vienna who shocked nobility by playing brilliantly at a court event. No one knew her name, but legend said she could play impossible pieces. The painting has been studied for decades. Historians always wondered who she was." He looked at Elena. "I don't believe in fate or destiny or any of that. But seeing you last night, then remembering this painting, maybe some things are meant to happen. Maybe some people are meant to play, no matter what century they're born in." Elena touched the painting gently. The girl in it did look like her, but more than that, she had the same expression Elena had seen in the mirror after playing. Exhausted but triumphant, drained but alive. "Keep it," Dmitri said. "It belongs with you." Before they could protest, he continued. "I've also established a foundation. The Vasquez Foundation, $50 million to start, with more to come. It will provide instruments and training to children whose families work in service industries. Rosa, I'd like you to run it if you're willing. You know better than anyone what these families need." Rosa sat down heavily, overwhelmed. "I don't know anything about running a foundation. You know about work. You know about dignity. You know about raising children with dreams bigger than their circumstances. That's all you need. The lawyers and accountants will handle the rest." Carlos chose that moment to burst through the door, home from school. He stopped dead, seeing his apartment full of strangers and cameras. "Elena, what's going on?" "Come here, little brother," Elena said, pulling him close. "Remember how you needed that surgery? Well, we can afford it now. Did you win the lottery?" Something like that. The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls, contracts, and decisions. Elena turned down most of the offers. She didn't need 50 recording contracts or 30 managers. She chose carefully. One recording deal that gave her creative control, one manager who understood that music mattered more than money, and acceptance to Juilliard not as a student, but as their youngest artist in residence. By evening, they'd moved to a hotel. The apartment was surrounded by media and they needed space to breathe. It was a nice hotel, the kind with room service and soft beds, but Elena couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, looking out at the city lights, holding the Guarneri del Jesus. "Play something," Rosa said from behind her. "Not for anyone else. Just for us." Elena raised the violin and began to play. Not Paganini this time, but a simple melody Rosa used to hum when Elena was little. It filled the hotel room with warmth, with memory, with love. Carlos sat on the bed, watching his sister with awe. Rosa closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. "I was so afraid," Rosa said when Elena finished. "All these years I was afraid that if you kept playing, you'd realize how small our life was. That you'd resent me for not being able to give you more." "Mama, no," Elena said, setting down the violin and taking her mother's hands. "You gave me everything. You showed me that dignity doesn't come from money. That hard work matters. That being invisible doesn't mean being worthless. I could play last night because you taught me to be strong. They held each other, the three of them, in that fancy hotel room that cost more per night than their monthly rent. Tomorrow would bring more chaos, interviews, concerts, recordings, fame. But tonight they were just a family that had survived the impossible. Elena's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Manuel, the elderly waiter from the party. "Thank you," it read. "My granddaughter plays cello. She was going to quit because she didn't think people like us could make it in classical music. Today she practiced for 3 hours. You didn't just change your life last night. You changed all of ours." More messages came in. From other service workers, from struggling musicians, from kids in public schools who'd been told to dream smaller. The video of Elena playing had been viewed 50 million times in less than 24 hours. Maid's daughter had become something bigger. A movement, a proof that talent could bloom anywhere. "What are you thinking?" Rosa asked, seeing Elena's expression. "I'm thinking about that foundation. I want to do more than just provide instruments. I want to create a whole program. Teachers, concert halls, opportunities. Not charity, but chances. Every kid whose parent cleans offices or serves food or drives buses should have the same opportunity to learn music that rich kids have. That's a big dream. Meja. You taught me to dream big, Mama. Just to do it quietly until the moment was right." Rosa smiled. Was last night the right moment? Elena thought about it. About all the years of hiding, of practicing in secret, of being invisible, about Dimitri's casual cruelty of offering an impossible bet, never imagining someone like her could win it. "Yes," she said firmly. It was exactly the right moment. As if in response, the violin case beside her seemed to glow in the lamplight. The Guarneri del Gesù had waited 300 years to sing the way it had last night. It could wait a little longer for the next performance, but not too long. Because now that Elena had stepped out of the shadows, she had no intention of stepping back. The maid's daughter had become the musician she was always meant to be, and the world would never be quite the same. The phone rang. It was someone from Carnegie Hall, offering her a solo concert whenever she wanted it. 6 months ago, Elena had snuck into Carnegie Hall through the service entrance with her mother, just to stand backstage and dream. Now they were offering her the stage itself. "December," she told them. "I'll play in December. And I want tickets set aside for service workers and their families. Free tickets. The best seats in the house." The person on the other end paused, probably shocked at a teenager making demands of Carnegie Hall. Then, "Of course, Ms. Vasquez. Whatever you want." Whatever she wanted. The words felt foreign but exciting. For the first time in her life, Elena Vasquez could have whatever she wanted. But what she wanted most hadn't changed. To play music that moved people, that broke down walls, that proved beauty existed everywhere. She picked up the violin again and began to play. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything. December in New York was cold and bright, with snow falling softly on the city streets. But inside Carnegie Hall, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Tonight was Elena's debut concert, and every single seat was filled. The audience was unlike any Carnegie Hall had ever seen. In the orchestra section, where tickets usually cost thousands of dollars, sat hotel maids still wearing their work uniforms because they'd come straight from their shifts. Janitors sat next to senators. Bus drivers sat beside billionaires. The ushers, usually stern about maintaining order, were smiling with tears in their eyes. Many of them knew these service workers personally. Backstage, Elena stood in her dressing room, but she wasn't alone. Rosa was there, wearing an elegant dress they'd bought together, the first new dress Rosa had owned in 20 years. Carlos was there too, fully recovered from his surgery, bouncing with 13-year-old energy. And surprisingly, Dmitry Volkov was there, though he stood quietly in the corner. 5 minutes, Ms. Vasquez, the stage manager called. Elena looked at herself in the mirror. She wore a simple black dress, nothing flashy or expensive. The only jewelry was a small silver necklace her father had given her before he died. She looked like herself, not a transformed Cinderella, but Elena Vasquez, the maid's daughter who could play. "Are you nervous?" Carlos asked. "Terrified," Elena admitted with a smile. "Good," Rosa said, adjusting Elena's hair one final time. "Fear keeps you sharp. Your father used to say that before his boxing matches." Their father had been a boxer, not famous, not successful, but passionate. He died when Elena was 10, leaving them with nothing but debt and memories. But he'd also left them with something else, the belief that fighting for your dreams was worth the bruises. "Ms. Vasquez, it's time." Elena picked up the Guarneri del Gesù. In the 6 months since that night, she'd played it every day, learning its personality, its quirks, its voice. It was no longer Dimitri's trophy, it was her partner. As she walked toward the stage, Dimitri spoke for the first time. "Elena," she turned. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not for playing that night. For teaching me to see." Over the past 6 months, Dimitri had changed dramatically. He'd sold 3 of his houses, donating the money to the Vasquez Foundation. He'd learned the names of every person who worked for him. He'd started taking violin lessons himself, though he was terrible at it. The arrogant billionaire was gone, replaced by someone trying to become human again. Elena nodded to him, then walked onto the stage. The applause that greeted her was deafening. The entire audience rose to their feet before she'd played a single note. She saw faces in the crowd, Manuel the waiter in the front row, the kitchen staff from that night scattered throughout the hall, her high school music teacher crying in the balcony. But most importantly, she saw children, hundreds of children from the Vasquez Foundation program, holding their own violins, watching her with eyes full of possibility. Elena waited for the applause to die down, then spoke into the microphone. "6 months ago, I was invisible. I served champagne to people who didn't see me. I cleaned rooms for people who didn't know my name. I played music in subway stations with my face covered because I was ashamed, not of my music, but of my need to play it for spare change." The hall was completely silent now. Tonight, I'm visible. But I'm not the only one. Every person in this hall who works with their hands, who serves others, who keeps the city running while remaining unseen. You're all visible tonight. This concert is for you, for us. She raised the violin and began to play. She started with Bach, simple, pure, beautiful, music that didn't show off but instead showed truth. As she played, images appeared on screens around the hall, photos from the past 6 months. The Vasquez Foundation's first class of students getting their instruments, Rosa teaching a room full of parents that their children's dreams mattered, Carlos helping younger kids with their music theory homework. Then she moved to Mozart and the photos changed. They showed the children's first recital, held in a community center in Queens. The audience had been small, just parents and siblings, but the joy on the children's faces was enormous. One photo showed a little girl, the daughter of a hotel maid, playing her first scale with such concentration that her tongue stuck out. When she reached the Brahms, a special guest joined her on stage, one of the students from the foundation, a shy boy named David whose father drove a taxi. He was only 11, had been playing for just 4 months, but Elena had heard something special in him. Together they played a duet that Brahms had written for a teacher and student. David was nervous, missed a few notes, but Elena adjusted seamlessly, supporting him, lifting him up. When they finished, the audience erupted. David's father, still in his taxi driver's vest, was sobbing openly. "That was beautiful, David," Elena whispered to him. "Remember this feeling? This is why we play." As David left the stage, grinning so wide it looked like his face might split, Elena prepared for the final piece, the piece everyone had come to hear. "6 months ago," she said, "I played Paganini's Caprice No. 24 to win a bet. Tonight I play it because I love it, because it's impossible and beautiful and angry and joyful all at once, because it reminds me that impossible is just a word people use when they can't imagine wanting something enough." She began to play, and it was different from that night at the penthouse. Then she'd played with desperation, with anger, with something to prove. Now she played with joy. The technical passages that had been weapons before were now celebrations. The impossible stretches were now dance moves. The music filled Carnegie Hall like light filling a cathedral. In the audience, cell phones came out, not to record but to illuminate. Thousands of small lights swayed with the music, turning the hall into a galaxy. Elena saw it and smiled, never missing a note, incorporating the audience into the performance. As she reached the final variation, the one that had made Dimitri collapse 6 months ago, she thought about everything that had changed. The foundation had already helped 300 children get instruments and lessons. Rosa had become a powerful advocate, speaking at the United Nations about the importance of arts education for all economic classes. Carlos was thriving in school, no longer worried about money, free to be a kid. But more than that, the story had changed something in the city itself. The Maid's daughter miracle, as the media called it, had made people look differently at the invisible workers around them. Companies had started offering arts programs for employees' children. The mayor had increased funding for music education in public schools. 3 other billionaires had created similar foundations, not wanting to be outdone by Dimitri's transformation. The final notes of the caprice rang out, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Then the hall exploded. The audience didn't just applaud. They roared, they wept, they hugged strangers. The standing ovation went on for 15 minutes. Elena bowed, then gestured for Rosa and Carlos to join her on stage. Rosa walked out, dignified and beautiful, no longer the invisible cleaning lady, but a foundation director who'd just been featured in Time magazine. Carlos ran out, still young enough to be embarrassed by the attention but proud of his sister. "None of this happens without her," Elena said, holding her mother's hand. "Rosa Vasquez, who cleaned houses so I could dream, who sacrificed everything so her children could have more, who taught me that dignity doesn't come from what you do, but how you do it." Rosa took the microphone, surprising everyone. She rarely spoke publicly. "My daughter thinks she changed our lives that night," she said, her accent thick but her words clear. "But she's wrong. She changed the world. She showed that talent has no address, no bank account, no pedigree. She showed that sometimes the people serving the champagne are the ones who should be on stage." As they stood there, mother, daughter and son, the lights of Carnegie Hall shining on them, the Guarneri del Gesù gleaming in Elena's hands, the audience on its feet, something was complete. Not ending, but complete. The encore Elena played was simple, Amazing Grace. She played it slowly, thoughtfully, letting each note hang in the air. The audience sang along, their voices joining together, janitors and executives, immigrants and natives, the seen and the formerly unseen. When the last note faded away, when the curtain finally fell, when the lights came up and the audience slowly filed out, many of them stayed. They stood in groups, talking, exchanging numbers, making plans. Children with their new violins asked Elena to sign them. Parents shared stories of their own hidden talents, their own deferred dreams. Outside Carnegie Hall, the snow continued to fall. The city looked clean and bright, full of possibility. Television crews waited to interview Elena, but she slipped out the stage door with her family. There would be time for interviews tomorrow. Tonight was for them. As they walked through Central Park, the Guarneri del Gesù safely in its case, Carlos running ahead to throw snowballs, Rosa and Elena walked arm in arm. "What now?" Rosa asked. Elena thought about it. She had concerts scheduled around the world. She had recording sessions planned. She had master classes to teach. But more importantly, she had 300 kids waiting for their next lesson and applications from thousands more.